Can Africa get back what the West has stolen from it in the last 500 years? For centuries, African nations were looted, first through the brutal transatlantic slave trade, and later through colonial rule, which stripped the continent of its resources, land, and wealth. The scars of that exploitation still shape Africa's economy today. Now, African leaders are demanding reparations. At a major summit in Ethiopia, the African Union AU is pushing for justice, financial compensation, land restitution, and policy changes that acknowledge the past. But the response from the West has been predictable: silence, dismissal, and outright rejection. The fight for reparations isn't new. African nations have been demanding accountability for decades. But could this be the moment where they finally force the world to listen? Here, we would like to take a moment and thank you for supporting us and being a valued part of our strong community. And if you are not yet a member, we encourage you to join us and help build an even stronger community together. Let's get started. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, more than 12.5 million Africans were kidnapped, chained, and sold into slavery. They were transported across the Atlantic like cargo, forced to build the economies of Europe and the Americas, while their continent was drained of its people and resources. Slavery was not just a crime against humanity. It was an economic engine that powered the rise of Western nations while leaving Africa in ruins. Portugal, Britain, France, and other European powers became global empires because of the free labor they extracted from Africa. The Industrial Revolution was fueled by raw materials harvested from plantations worked by enslaved Africans, with cotton, sugar, and tobacco generating vast wealth for Western economies. America's rise as an economic powerhouse was built on centuries of unpaid black labor. The slave trade was not an accident of history. It was a calculated system of exploitation designed to enrich the West at Africa's expense. And now, if you think slavery ended with abolition, you've been lied to. The chains were never broken. They were just replaced with contracts, debts, and modern systems of control. The West didn't stop exploiting African labor. They just found new ways to make it look legal. From forced labor in African mines to the modern-day trafficking of African migrants, slavery is alive and well. But the biggest trick of all? Making the world believe it ended. Abolitionists fought to end slavery in the 19th century, and on paper, they won. But look deeper, and you'll see that slavery never really disappeared. It simply evolved. The same Western nations that claimed to have ended slavery immediately introduced colonial forced labor. In Belgian-controlled Congo, millions of Africans were still being worked to death in rubber plantations under conditions just as brutal as the transatlantic slave trade. In British and French colonies, Africans were forced to build roads, harvest crops, and work in mines for no pay, all while their resources were stolen and sent to Europe.
Questo è un bambino che lavora in una miniera d'oro in Burkina Faso. Il Burkina Faso è una delle nazioni più povere del mondo. Per il Burkina Faso, che ha l'oro, la Francia stampa moneta coloniale. In cambio pretende che finiscano nelle casse del tesoro francese il 50% di tutto quello che il Burkina Faso esporta. L'oro che questo bambino si infila in un cunicolo per tirare fuori finisce per lo più nelle casse dello Stato francese. Allora la soluzione non è prendere gli africani e spostarli in Europa. La soluzione è liberare l'Africa da certi europei che la sfruttano e consentire a queste persone di vivere di quello che hanno.
Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. When colonial rule ended, did things change? Not really. The moment African nations declared independence, they were handed a new kind of chain: crippling debt. These weren't ordinary debts. They were engineered to keep Africa economically enslaved to the West. France, for example, forced its former colonies to deposit 50% of their national reserves into the French treasury, a system that continues today under the CFA franc. These countries are technically free, yet their economies are controlled by Paris. If slavery was about forced labor, what do you call a system where entire nations must work to pay off debts they never agreed to in the first place? Think slavery is a thing of the past? Check your pocket. If you own a smartphone, chances are it contains cobalt, a mineral mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo under horrific conditions. Over 40,000 children work in Congolese mines, digging for cobalt with their bare hands, inhaling toxic dust, and risking their lives every day. Some of these children are as young as 6 years old. They are not employees. They are slaves. Western tech companies, including Apple, Tesla, and Samsung, profit from this system. They rely on cheap African labor to keep costs down while presenting themselves as ethical businesses. But the truth is that the supply chain for modern technology is built on African suffering, just like the cotton and sugar industries of the past. The only difference? Today's slaves don't wear chains. They carry pickaxes. And it's not just cobalt. Ghana and Ivory Coast produce 60% of the world's cocoa, yet the people growing the chocolate we consume are trapped in poverty. More than 1.5 million child laborers work in West African cocoa farms, harvesting beans for Nestlé, Hershey, and other Western corporations. Many of these children are trafficked, forced to work for no pay, and beaten if they try to escape. Slavery isn't history. It's in every bar of chocolate and every smartphone. If you still believe slavery is a relic of the past, let's talk about Libya. In 2017, CNN exposed a modern-day slave market in Libya, where African migrants were being sold for as little as $400. Men, women, and children fleeing poverty and war were captured by smugglers, locked in warehouses, and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Some were forced into unpaid labor, while others, especially women, were sold into sex slavery. Libya became a transit hub for African migrants trying to reach Europe. But instead of providing aid, European governments backed policies that empowered warlords and human traffickers. The European Union even funded the Libyan Coast Guard to stop migrant boats, knowing full well that many of those migrants would end up in detention camps where they would be enslaved, tortured, or killed. What's worse, the same Western nations that claimed to stand for human rights did nothing. The world watched as black bodies were auctioned off like cattle, and the outrage lasted for a few weeks before the media moved on. The Libyan slave trade never ended. It simply became less newsworthy. Slavery was never just about owning people. It was about controlling labor, resources, and wealth. Today, Africa remains at the bottom of the global economic system, supplying the raw materials that fuel Western industries while receiving none of the profits. African farmers, miners, and workers continue to toil in conditions that mirror slavery, while multinational corporations reap the benefits. The narrative that slavery ended is a carefully crafted illusion designed to absolve Western nations of responsibility. But look at the facts, and the reality is clear. African children are still digging in mines for Western companies. African migrants are still being sold like cattle. African workers are still producing goods they cannot afford to buy. And African nations are still shackled by debts they did not create. If slavery really ended, why is the world still structured to keep Africa at the bottom? If freedom is real, why are African lives still treated as disposable? The truth is that slavery never disappeared. It just evolved. The only question now is, when will Africa break free? Now Africa is asking for reparations. And don't get confused with it. If a thief robs a family and then builds an empire with the stolen money, does it make sense to say, that was in the past, let's move on? Africa is not begging for favors. It is demanding what was stolen. Reparations are not charity, they are justice, and the refusal to pay them is nothing less than an attempt to cover up the greatest robbery in human history. The first and most obvious form of reparations is direct financial compensation. This is not a new idea. Germany was required to compensate Holocaust survivors, and the United States paid reparations to Japanese Americans who were imprisoned in internment camps during World War II. Even in the case of slavery, Britain compensated slave owners for their loss of property when slavery was abolished, but not a single penny was given to the enslaved. The double standard is glaring. The West has built unimaginable wealth off Africa's suffering. The British economy, which dominated global trade for centuries, was funded by profits from sugar plantations worked by enslaved Africans. France drained billions from its African colonies through forced labor and heavy taxation. Portugal transported more Africans into slavery than any other nation and still benefits from economic structures built during its colonial rule. The transatlantic slave trade was not just a moral atrocity, it was a business, one that made European and American elites incredibly rich while leaving Africa stripped of its people and resources. And the theft did not end with slavery. Colonialism continued the looting, ensuring that Africa's wealth flowed into European and American banks while Africans remained poor. African labor built the roads, railways, and industries that fueled Western economies. Yet even after gaining independence, African nations were forced into economic arrangements that kept them subservient. If financial compensation was deemed necessary for other groups that suffered historical injustices, why is Africa treated differently? Reparations go beyond money. Land was stolen from African people on a massive scale, and in many cases, it is still in the hands of the descendants of European settlers. This is especially visible in countries like South Africa, where a white minority continues to own the vast majority of agricultural land, despite making up less than 10% of the population. The South African government has attempted land reform programs, but resistance from white landowners and global financial institutions has stalled real progress. The reality is that indigenous Africans remain landless in their own countries, while the descendants of colonizers still control the wealth. Zimbabwe's attempt to reclaim land for black farmers was met with economic sabotage. Western nations imposed sanctions, crippling the country's economy as punishment for daring to take back what was stolen. This is the power dynamic that remains in place. When Africa demands justice, it is threatened, punished, and isolated. But this does not change the truth. Land that was taken through violence and deception must be returned. Africa's wealth was not just stolen in the form of labor and resources, its very history was looted. Walk into the British Museum in London, and you will find African treasures that were taken during colonial invasions. France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands all house artifacts that were stolen from African nations, displayed as if they were mere souvenirs rather than sacred objects. These include the Benin bronzes, intricate metal sculptures created by the Edo people of present-day Nigeria, which were looted by British soldiers in 1897. They also include the Rosetta Stone, taken from Egypt by the British in 1801, and countless masks, thrones, and ceremonial artifacts that were stripped from African cultures. These are not just historical objects, they are symbols of Africa's identity, spiritual heritage, and historical continuity. Keeping them locked in Western museums is an extension of colonialism, a continued claim over African history. If these objects truly belong to humanity, as Western institutions argue, then why were they stolen in the first place? Returning them would be a small but significant step toward righting the wrongs of the past. Reparations should not be limited to money, land, and artifacts. African and Caribbean leaders are also demanding technology and investment transfers as a form of reparative justice. The Caribbean Reparations movement, led by CARICOM, has outlined a 10-point plan that includes technology sharing, education funding, and direct investment in healthcare and infrastructure. Africa should demand the same. During colonial rule, Africa was deliberately kept technologically and scientifically underdeveloped. Western nations extracted raw materials from Africa, but never invested in industrialization, ensuring that African economies remained dependent. The result is a system where Africa provides the world's resources, but cannot manufacture high-value products. This imbalance was not natural, it was engineered. If reparations are to be meaningful, they must include technology transfers that allow Africa to develop industries, create jobs, and compete on the global stage. Western nations have a moral responsibility to invest in African economies, not through predatory loans but through direct collaboration that benefits African nations rather than foreign corporations. Investment in healthcare is another critical demand. The same colonial powers that exploited Africa's resources did little to develop healthcare systems, and today, African countries struggle with preventable diseases while Western pharmaceutical companies make billions selling overpriced medicine. Reparations should include major investments in African medical research, hospitals, and infrastructure to ensure that future generations are not left behind. Reparations are not just about acknowledging the past. They are about creating a future where Africa is no longer economically shackled by the consequences of colonial exploitation. The idea that reparations for Africa are too complicated or unrealistic is a convenient excuse. Western nations have paid reparations before when it suited them. They compensated Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. They paid Japanese Americans who were unjustly imprisoned. Even slave owners were compensated when slavery ended. The only reason Africa is treated differently is that the economic system built on African exploitation is still in place. Africa is not asking for favors. It is demanding what was stolen. Nothing more, nothing less. The refusal to pay reparations is not just an economic issue. It is a statement that African lives, labor, and history are worth less than those of other people. But the tide is turning. As more African nations unite behind the call for reparations, the pressure will only grow. The West can delay, but it cannot be denied forever. History has a way of correcting itself. The only question is, when will the world finally pay its debt to Africa? If Western nations refuse to acknowledge their debts, can Africa force them to pay? The African Union is taking a bold step forward, working on a unified strategy to push for reparations. At the recent AU summit, African leaders discussed legal action, diplomatic pressure, and alliances with other global movements. One major strategy is to take former colonial powers to international courts. If Western nations refuse to negotiate, African countries could seek justice through legal mechanisms that hold states accountable for historical crimes. Another approach is to apply diplomatic pressure by involving the United Nations and other global institutions. The AU is also working with the Caribbean reparations movement, strengthening alliances between Africa and the African diaspora to push for global change. For decades, discussions around reparations have been ignored or stalled. But this time, Africa is making it clear that it won't let the issue fade away. The growing global awareness of racial injustice has made it harder for Western nations to dismiss these demands. The fight for reparations has been going on for 30 years, yet progress has been slow. The best-case scenario is that the AU's push gains traction, forcing Western nations into negotiations and securing tangible reparations for Africa. The worst-case scenario is that the movement fades into another cycle of debates with no real action. For Africa to win this fight, it must remain united. Internal divisions weaken the movement, making it easier for Western nations to ignore demands. African leaders must also mobilize public support, exposing Western hypocrisy and keeping the issue at the forefront of global discussions. The world needs to understand that this is not about looking back. It's about making sure the future is not built on stolen wealth. Nations like South Africa and Burkina Faso are taking bold steps in land reform, proving that Africa is no longer willing to accept historical injustices. In South Africa, where white landowners still control a disproportionate share of farmland due to colonial dispossession, the government has been pushing for policies to redistribute land to Black South Africans. Despite fierce resistance from Western-backed interests and economic sabotage threats, land expropriation without compensation remains on the agenda. Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, is also reclaiming its land and resources from foreign corporations. By nationalizing key sectors and prioritizing local ownership, the country is breaking free from neo-colonial control. Western nations and financial institutions have attempted to pressure these governments into backing down, using economic tactics and political threats. But the message is clear: Africa will not be intimidated. These land reforms are more than policies. They are statements of defiance. They signal that African nations are taking back control of their resources and destinies, regardless of external opposition. The fight for reparations and justice is not just about words. It is about action. Africa will not retreat. It will reclaim what was stolen, one step at a time. Do you think the West can no longer run away from its wrongdoings? Should it finally pay back? Let us know in the comments section. Should Africa try to get what rightfully belongs to Africa the hard way? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.